Thank you, thank you. Thank you for that very warm welcome, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. I like the title, the concept of this conference very much. This is what we all got to think about. The food we eat really matters. It matters in so many ways. As Steve said, he said 60 years. It's actually been 65 years now since I started my graduate research. And it's been a long number of years, and I've had a variety of experiences. And so the new book that I'm now just finishing with, working with my grandson actually, is an attempt to summarize some of the highlights that affected my thinking. Because my thinking in the very beginning, 65 years ago, was very different, as I'll show in a moment, and as many of you may know. And so it's been a challenge. It's been a challenge at times. It's also been extraordinarily rewarding, meeting so many good people in this whole movement. And so I want to share with you just some highlights, essentially, of some of the things I learned and what I think it meant as I look back. You know, it's always nice to have some hindsight, as all of you know. And so as I look back, I can see, I think, the main things that affected my thinking, and also the kind of things that I think can be actually very rewarding. As Steve said, my discipline, my formal discipline, is nutritional science. And that's a topic that has not been appreciated, as all of you know. It's at the fundamental basis, in fact, for the so-called whole food plant-based diet. And it's that science, it's the way we do this science that really matters. And I want to share with you, in a sense, some of the things we did along the way. And I think of science as, you know, you do a whole lot of different kinds of experiments, and you have this experience and that experience. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to sit back and look at all those details and see what it means in the whole. And so my title, as you can see, is Nutritional Science. It's not quite what I just said it is. It's a centuries-old disaster. I really mean that, because I've just finished another book retracing some of the things that we think about nutrition for the last century at least, and actually goes back to the late 1700s. There was a time when I was at Oxford University for a year and getting a lot of pushback, and was curious about, you know, what's going on here? What is causing the hostility? What is causing the emotion of this topic? So I want to share with you then just kind of a summary of some of these things that this is, in a sense, this is the first of a series of lectures, but I tried to see what I can get under one roof, you know, as far as that 65 years that we're concerned. So I'm going to start out and share with you one of the benchmarks that I had in my career. This is back in 1980 to 82. At that time, I had already been in research, doing studies, publishing things, and that sort of thing for about, actually more than 20 years. So I had the pleasure of being invited to serve on a panel of the National Academy of Science on diet, nutrition, and cancer. And this, incidentally, was a first attempt by an official agency, if you will, to actually deal with the subject of the relationship of diet and nutrition with cancer. I was on the panel. There were 13 of us at the time. This was the first of its kind. And so it was a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun in that particular sense, so debating issues and so forth and so on. And so this report eventually turned out to be the most sought-after report in the history of the National Academy. Such was the interest of this topic for the public. To talk about something like cancer and diet and what you eat might make a difference and that sort of thing, we made some really modest recommendations. I mean, it was, at the time, it was kind of new. We had to be kind of careful. You can't go too far out of line with what the facts are. And so we did something to advocate vegetables, fruits, and grains. Whoop-de-doo. I mean, you know, that's pretty simple. But you can't believe how much commotion that caused, quite frankly, at the time. We said, also amongst the general information, something specific. We were the first ones to say to reduce total fat, dietary fat, from the average of somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 to 40% or so, down to 30%. When we were deliberating on the question of how much the fat should be reduced in the diet, there were some of us pointing to the fact that we had some information that should be lower than 30%. And at the end of the day, we were advised by one of the members of our committee, if you go below 30%, that's going to mean cutting into the consumption of animal foods, and animal protein in particular. But in any case, it was got a kind of tip off. I mean, I was already aware at that time that to talk about animal protein as a nutrient was a little touchy, a little sensitive to say the least. It still is, as many of you know. So we stopped at 30%, and so the origin of that 30% figure was nothing more than a mathematical, if you will, or cultural kind of thing. Okay, we can go to the 30%. We couldn't say 29% because that might mean cutting into animal food. So I want to make that point. We'll come back to it in a moment. That affected me a great deal because at that point, the research that I was doing was, in fact, based, as you'll hear in a moment, on the role of protein, particularly animal protein, in disease formation. Along the way in the book, too, we talked about individual nutrients and what we thought they were and so forth and so on, what they could do. But we summarized in the executive summary something that was actually quite highlighted at the time. We were not advocating the use of nutrients as single chemicals. We were talking about the whole food. And so we did not, in fact, support the idea and called attention to the readers of the book that we were not, in fact, talking about advocating nutrient supplements. Mind you, this is 1982. How many long is that's 40 years ago. But in any case, and I became quite involved in discussions involving whether or not nutrient supplements could do the same thing as food. But in any case, then we had chapters in there on the different nutrients, like fat and sugar or carbohydrate, if you will, and vitamins and minerals, so forth and so on. But the committee did not want to have a chapter on protein. Well, that's why I was there, in a sense, because that was my work. So I persuaded the committee, okay, let me write that. We should have a chapter on protein. And finally, they kind of conceded, okay, you write the chapter. You write the draft. So I wrote the draft and got a little bit of attention drawn to the question of protein. I should say a lot of attention, because I wrote the chapter with a colleague of mine, and there it was, stuck in the book. But in due course, it was a sensitive nerve. Just the question talking about protein was a sensitive nerve. So as a result of that, and then unfortunately, in many ways, I kind of became the face of that committee, in part, because I was only one of two of the 13 of us, only one of two who actually had been involved in the experimental research, in a sense. And mine was focused on protein. So I was also asked at the time to present to congressional committees and be on PBS with McNair Lair and magazines and stuff like that. And because this topic that I was concerned about, protein, it was a sensitive topic, usually in the negative, I should say. I'm just going to itemize for you. I'll come back to this. I don't want to dwell on this. But as a result of being on that panel, and my professional society actually at the time, there was an attempt by the two leading authorities in that whole federation of medical societies, about 85,000, I think, membership at that time. But in any case, they proposed that I get expelled from my society. This is at the time that I had just already been nominated by the society, their choice to be the president of the society. Kind of strange, and so the results weren't what I thought I was told they were, but in any case, they tried to expel me from the society. I mean, that was kind of a formal procedure. Go to Washington, get heard, and so forth and so on. But they failed, fortunately. I was told the basis for that concern, that very deep concern, was the fact that I had betrayed my nutritional research community. And I had become probably a little bit too visible about speaking my mind on some things. There were other things. There's a whole string of stuff, and I'm telling that another occasion. But an allegation I had that I had fraudulently taken money from my grant that was sent to 32 members around Washington, the head of the NIH, the head of the FDA, Senator Kennedy, and some others. That didn't go any place, fortunately, but just a kind of reaction. I'm always telling you this, not to complain, to be honest about it. In fact, I'm happy to have some of those experiences because it taught me something. It taught me what the system is really all about. In any case, then probably one of the most significant, at least I look back, I had been getting money from the National Institutes of Health quite successfully. We were fairly generously supported through all those years. And in one occasion, so I've been on both sides of the table. I've been on the review committees looking at the applications of others, and then being the recipient and being on policy too. So I know that system. I know the way the NIH system works. And when we apply for funding to do a research, we are required to define really rather well, if we can, what we want to study. We have to defend it. And it's a very competitive system. Well, in any case, to make a long story short, what happens, what the scientific committees determine is the highest priority to be funded, usually the top 16%, that's automatically funded by the administration. I wanted to extend, at that point in time, our China study had already started. It was 1987, 88. At that time, I already had started this study in China. But the real part of the China study never got done. I was really interested in using that opportunity that we did to actually gather together 500,000 people in China and to follow them forward by collecting blood samples and then being able to monitor the kind of changes that occur prior to the getting various inflammatory diseases. We were awarded the money. We were awarded the money. Should have been automatic. Unfortunately, when I went to Washington, they invited me down to pick up the check. I got first one institute put down a $700,000 check for me to take home, but there's a couple other institutes there too. Wanted to have something to say about this. This was before the China study had become known to the public, but they knew about it, of course. And I was handed a letter that said that I was a fraud. And so as a result, that $7 million I was to get for building on the China study to become what it could have become was denied. I never heard of anyone in my community actually having a grant application awarded on scientific grounds, but then in turn denied by administration. So I want to get past that. I just wanted to say the seriousness, the significance of what really happens, unfortunately, in the scientific community, and one of the reasons why the public does not get to know this kind of information. There was something else I saw at the time that really piqued my interest. It was a little study here done in 1981. Not a little study, it was a fairly good sized study. These researchers, in this case, were looking to see whether there are some other factors amongst smokers that might affect the risk of getting lung cancer. And so this is a three-dimensional chart, as you can see. Along the one, I don't know whether I can, if I point this thing, you won't see what I'm pointing at, but in any case, okay, let's do it this way. There's two axes there. There's a XY axis on the bottom, as you can see. On the left, that's the amount of beta-carotene being consumed amongst smokers, smoking various amounts of cigarettes, if you will. And you can see along the left side, I wish I could get, this is not working here. Okay. Can you see things? Okay. Yeah, I'm inclined to want, well, I can't get away from there, I'm trapped. Not the first time I've been trapped. But in any case, look at the chart. Okay, here we go. I got to be able to see. Yeah. Can I? It doesn't get there. Oh, well. Pardon? I can't go over there because then I don't have this. Okay, here we go. So in any case, it still didn't show up. I think it's on the side is the problem. What? Oh. Okay. This is too scientific for me. So anyhow, thank you. So here's a chart. As you can see there, the results of this big study. Along one axis, along here, is the amount of beta-carotene being consumed. Beta-carotene, as you know, being the pre-vitamin A, if you will. It turns into vitamin A, as it was said in those days. Along the other axis over here is the amount of smoking, the length of smoking, up to people who were smoking more than 30 years. Now, if we look and see what those results were, if we come over here on the right hand, over on the far side here, these are the heaviest smokers. And they're divided up according to how much cancer they get. They're dividing up according to basically how much beta-carotene they were consuming while they're smoking. And what was found in here, there are 4 different groups, if you will, from low to high. The ones with the least consumption of beta-carotene, only from plants, mind you. Pardon me, okay? The ones consuming the least amount of beta-carotene, you can see a huge effect. The risk of death for those people was very high. And then if you go, up the scale, in a sense, with beta-carotene consumption, 4 different groups, the more beta-carotene they consumed, the lower was the lung cancer risk. Now, the fact that this was basically, okay, I got too much equipment here. Never mind, I'll just over here and do this. So the idea was this. If you look at the right-hand part of the chart, you can see what we call a dose-response relationship. The more beta-carotene they consumed, the lower was the lung cancer risk. Wow. I mean, lung cancer and smoking were already connected in those days fairly well. But just the mere notion that something like beta-carotene, a nutrient, could have such an effect on lung cancer. I talked about it a little bit, got quoted someplace, and one of my friends who was in the business of trying to get people to stop smoking, it was a WHO, a very fine fellow, was concerned that I shouldn't be talking about this because it's a hard enough job to get people to stop smoking. I understood that point of view. That wasn't the issue. But in this particular case here, what it showed to me was an indication that nutrition, in the form of beta-carotene in this case, really had a prominent effect on a serious disease like lung cancer among people consuming a lot of cigarettes. So that was quite stark, to say the least. So low beta-carotene, if you will, promotes cancer. Mind you, this is 1981, this was published. It's saying even if you smoke, I hate to say this, I don't want to send the wrong message, even if you smoke and you eat your spinach, your risk of getting lung cancer might be close to 0 or background. That sounds ridiculous, but that's actually what these data here showed. I'm not sure I can go along with that idea in a larger context, obviously, but nonetheless, what it did for me is to say nutrition matters. It really matters. And at that time, we already were doing our research in the laboratory about another nutrient and another cancer. So we can generalize here, if you will, the impressive association of nutrition with serious disease, just to put it in just a general vernacular. Not a very exciting idea. But in 1971, 10 years before that, there was this publication from a big study there that when people quit smoking, look at the bottom part of the chart, when people quit smoking, they tend to get less disease the longer it is that they have quit smoking. And so what it says here, for all these diseases, not just lung cancer up on the upper left-hand corner or heart disease, but it turns out all of these diseases were recorded. The number of deaths, mortality if you will, the mortality rates for these different diseases after 5 to 10 years of quitting smoking, it was almost back to baseline. So another rather spectacular observation that nutrition is not only important in a serious disease like lung cancer comes from smoking, a lot of other diseases too. I found that really exciting at that time. It really certainly had an impact on me and the way we were doing our research that tended to be focused on one thing at a time. So we talk about reversal. I was seeing here evidence that disease could be reversed. This is, well, I mentioned that more about that. So anyhow, that's the scene. That's the scene. Just getting, I'm far enough along at that point in time to be getting excited about the role of nutrition in cancer. But to see these kind of results, generalized as they may be, nonetheless pointing to something really significant. So let's go back a few more years. That's me there in 5 or 6 years ago, I think now. Combining. I was raised on a dairy farm, as many of you may know, and it's me there on the front, sort of combining so we could get some money to go to school. We were raised on a dairy farm. That's my brothers and my father's mother. But so on the farm, to the extent that I thought about this, and I have to be honest, I didn't think about it, but it's just being, sort of unconsciously aware that the milk that we were producing on the farm was valued in large measure because it had protein in it, high quality protein. It was also valued because of the calcium content too. I went way then to Cornell University to graduate school. And there, I did my doctoral dissertation shown on the right. Won't go into details there, but just generally speaking, it was designed to show, it was designed especially by my professors and others, to show the importance of protein. It was designed to try to figure out ways to grow animal protein more efficiently. So there you have it. I mean, it's just, that's where it was. Then it was another 10-year period when I was working in the Philippines and the State Department was at Virginia Tech, where in fact there, my responsibility was to be coordinator of a national program of developing sort of childhood feeding centers, again, focused on protein. And the big deal about that at that time with these poor children who were malnourished and many of them almost starving, the big thing that we were intending to do, my senior colleague and I, was to make sure to close the protein gap, as it said in those days. Such was the emphasis given to protein, across the land, publicly, professionally, politically, whatever. It was, everybody was obviously knowing we have to get as much protein as we can, okay? That's what our deal was, is to, oh, good, thank you. Can you hear me better? Yeah, okay. So I ended up in the Philippines. There, attempted to identify ways for these children to get more protein. That's why they're starving. That's why they're malnourished. There was so much emphasis given to that. So in reality, those three events, personal, up on the left, my graduate research directed to improving the production of protein down in the Philippines. So it was all about protein. The more, the better. And I think many of you can identify with that. How many of you have sort of gotten into this business and your friends ask you, where do you get your protein from? This idea still hangs around. So I want to work on that theme a bit. So now, I'm in the Philippines. I was aware we're supposed to be getting more protein. I can't get into all the details on that particular point of view. But about that time, this study came out in India, showing that in experimental animals, in this case rats, that when these rats are exposed to a carcinogen that gives rise to liver cancer, okay, it starts out, they're exposed to a carcinogen that gives rise to liver cancer. If they are fed a couple of levels of protein, high and low, that their thesis was, or hypothesis, was that the animals given the higher levels of protein would get less cancer. Such was the importance of protein. It does everything. If we could just get more protein consumed, we could have less cancer. That was our idea. And as you can see here, the opposite appeared. The opposite appeared. They couldn't even go along with their own results. Quite frankly, they went back and redid the study in a very different way and attempted to show it was the reverse. I had a chance to go to India about 25 years after that to talk about the fact that I didn't see it that way, that the animals given the highest protein levels got 100%, small study, 100% got the liver tumors, and the ones that fed 5%, none did. That was striking. Increasing protein, increasing cancer. How do you like that? So, I mean, so I'm wearing just two hats, and essentially I'm interested in the science. I want to deal with the facts, but on the other hand, we're all worshiping protein, if you will. And somehow like this comes along and kind of shakes the bushes a bit. So I came home, got a grant. It lasted for the next 27 years, and I really wanted to know, is that really true? And if it is true, how does it work? What's what we call mechanisms? So here's a little chart showing the first 12 weeks as the cancers are growing. I mean, all cancers start with a mutation, with a mutated gene. So they're exposed to a carcinogen that causes a mutation, okay? Then they're fed 20% of 5%, just like the Indian workers did. You can see the difference. It's huge. It's huge. Ones fed 20%, they're all getting cancer. It's growing fast. This is just during the first 3 months, which is quite a long time for a rat. But here's I want to show you this because something came up. This wasn't exactly done in this order, but here's what happened. I was curious about this idea that cancer is caused by genes, namely mutations. Mutation is, for those of you who are not familiar with this, our genes are mutated by chemical carcinogens. They're changed so that now the new gene, if it's not repaired, then becomes the basis for cancers to grow. I wanted to know in this particular case whether, let's say, after 2.5 months, they got the exposure to the carcinogen. At that time, you would think that all the mutations are all reversed, right? Or they're gone, or the carcinogen's not there. We fed them 20% protein, and lo and behold, what it showed was we saw a tumor response after one would have thought those genes are gone. No, they were still there, kind of hanging around. That led to a major consideration that over the years, it turns out that cancer, in this case here, suggested cancer doesn't form as a result of the gene or the mutation. It functions primarily, in this case at least, as a function of nutrition. Very different. So here's another way to look at the same thing. I ended up with a number of ideas that now since have become very provocative, even more provocative, in the sense that it tends to challenge the way we think or the way we do things. So here's my first challenge. Cancer begins with a mutated gene that may lie dormant until developed by nutrition, not by genes. Just think about that. We all have some genes that could give rise to cancer. We have the seeds, if you will. And the reason, for the most part, not to oversimplify, the reason we tend to get cancer is because we're feeding the wrong nutrition to those genes. So they come up and they form cancer. Here's another way to look at this. Same basis I showed before. I wanted to know in this particular case, what happens if we change the diet from 20 to 5% or 5% to 20%, if you will? Here's the results we got. First 3 weeks, these early cancers are growing in response to 20%. Turned off for the next 3 weeks. Turned back on, turned off. To me, that was really a spectacular sort of thing. The idea that we could take nutrition right within normal levels of consumption, more or less, and adjust it. Adjust the amount being consumed, and actually change the course of the development of the disease. That was very exciting. So in a sense, we were turning on and turning off cancer experimentally. So there's my second challenge. Cancer development is reversible by protein nutrition. That is turned on and off. And I'm saying that cancer is a nutritional disease. That's heresy. That is heresy of the first order, to me even suggested such a thing. But that's what we were getting. I couldn't turn away from the results we were getting. Protein is turning off, you take it away, it turns cancer off, okay? However, at that time, in the cancer industry, and still today, the National Cancer Institute, the American Cancer Society, and other cancer organizations, they say right up front, right on the face page of the internet, if you want to take a look, how cancer rises. Cancer is a genetic disease, so they say. Cancer is a function of what happens to our genes. When we convert a normal gene to a cancer gene, if you will, because of chemical carcinogens, that's a genetic disease. Okay, here's what comes out of that kind of thinking that still is with us today. If cancer is only a disease of genes, okay, we don't have much control, really, of what we're going to get or not going to get. So the idea that it starts out with a mutation, and now we knew then, incidentally, too, mutations don't reverse. They don't come backwards. They kind of stay there. They don't really reverse, except an occasional 1 out of 1,000,000 or something of that sort. But in any case, the genes that we may get that have the potential for causing cancer are there. So on that basis, if cancer is a genetic disease, it can't be reversed, what do you do about it? What do we do with it when we're interested in treating cancer? We can't make them reverse. That didn't happen. The only thing to do, and they don't quite say it this way, but I've been in this field long enough to know that this is a fact. The only way to deal with it is to kill the cancer cells. To kill the cancer cells with drugs. To some extent, the more toxic, the better. The more targeted, too, I should say. So we use drugs to control cancer and to treat people with cancer because it's all presumed that the disease is formed by genes. Now, I can apply the same argument to a considerable extent for other diseases as well. What I'm trying to say here is that we have a world in which we live, and we subconsciously almost think this way. Diseases form, is it because of genes? Oh, they all start with genes at some place. Is it because of genes we have, or is it because of what we do with those genes that are there? That's a really big sort of consideration, in my view. This leads to the idea of what I call genetic determinism. We live with it. We have lived with this idea throughout. And we have a major industry now in cancer research and cancer treatment. We have a major industry that relies on the presumption that cancer is a genetic disease, and we have to kill that cancer by developing drugs to treat the people to kill the cancer. And those drugs are, quite frankly, very toxic. We call them cytotoxic, the majority of them. That means they kill cells, cyto cells, toxic. So that's the cancer treatment business. Then we can ask a question this way. Here's some data that came out now. This is 2007, I think it was the first time it came out. Seemed like to me that was yesterday, but in any case, there's a history of this. So we can ask ourselves, how well is that idea working using chemotherapy agents? Well, some enterprising scientists from Australia and the United States got together, and they got access to a big database of a whole lot of cancer patients whose records had been stored at NIH. They got their hands on this big database, and they simply wanted to ask this question: how well are those cytotoxic chemotherapy agents working? And they had a collection of information on 22 different kinds of cancer. I mean, this is a big study. And so they were simply asking, how was it working? Well, the traditional way of asking that question and looking at results is to say, how effective are these chemotherapy agents? How effective is it to extend the 5-year survival rates? That's the hands-on model that they all use. How well are they working to extend the cancer person has beyond 5 years? So let me say this first. The average cost of developing a new cytotoxic chemotherapy agent is technically, this is 2014, $1.3 to $1.8 billion for one chemical. That's a lot of money. Just something to think about that. Actually, it's around $2.5 billion when you add in so-called opportunity costs. You know, the money you could have earned had you done something else with it, essentially. So there's a lot of money here being spent for chemotherapy. 22 different cancer types, as I said. In the aggregate, a couple exceptions, but in the aggregate, these drugs were only extending 5-year survival rate by 2.1%. That's background. That could easily be argued it would have been just the same as doing nothing. So the whole cancer treatment industry is spending a heck of a lot of money in my view, cause a lot of, unfortunately, confusion and suffering. But at the same time, with the results that we get like this, I really think this is pretty extraordinary. And incidentally, these chemotherapy agents that are used, many of them actually cause cancer on their own. So after the fact, the person survives, they can follow them up to some extent. It actually, some of them, quite a number of them, have that property. They're toxic because of their chemical reactivity, like a mutagen, basically. They're mutation things. And so toxic is this material that now the advertisement is given for if you go to a cancer patient room, in the bathroom, they now have to hang up a sign. It says, flush the toilet 3 times. Because if the cancer patient is using the facility, there might be a little trace of these toxins that somebody might touch. That's the nature of the agents that are being injected in order to control the cancer, kill the cancer cells. That's why this is a big deal. That's why I get really quite passionate about it, because what we're ignoring throughout this whole discussion in all these years is a possibility, just a possibility, that nutrition might play a role. And we need to know how. We haven't done that kind of research. I'm talking about treatment in this particular case, not just prevention. Now I want to move forward to another question. This goes back to my days in seeing how protein causes cancer in animals. And so this is the scheme that we use in research, those of us in cancer research. We divide the whole process from stage 1 is initiation. That's when the mutations occur. That can happen within minutes, hours, whatever, a very short time. Then these cells, if they go to are converted to a cancer cell, then they go through maybe years, during which time they're growing and dividing and eventually growing as a tumor. We call that promotion. And then they finally, when we know we have something, we get diagnosed with it. That's, of course, at a serious, really serious stage. That's progression. Notice how those errors are there. The consensus is, what I just told you a moment ago, the consensus has been that once cancer starts, it's going to keep on going. And about the only way we can do something about it is kill those cells with those agents. Well, it turns out, I want to look for mechanism. I want to figure out, how does this protein thing work? Is there any evidence, any way we can explain it? So let's look at the first stage, initiation. I got listed there a lot of technical things we did. Each one of these things we did usually involved a graduate student of mine for a whole Ph.D. dissertation, so it would take like 2 or 3 years to do some of this research on average. In any case, I was looking for the mechanism, the elusive mechanism, because if we could find the key mechanism, guess what? Then we could go out and maybe find a drug to stop that reaction. That's fundamental to the entire drug industry, by the way. We're going to get one thing, we're going to find it. All these things are 5 things. 5 things. Doing that over some period of years, 10, 12 years. And then I wanted to go to promotion stage. Okay, assuming it only goes in one direction. But in reality, it's reversible. That's what our work was showing, and we weren't the first to do that. There was some evidence of this way back in 1939, not very well publicized, the whole idea that cancer could be reversed, turned on and turned off kind of thing. So we looked for mechanisms there too. If we got 5 of them there during the initiation stage, every one of them, when the high protein was increased, every one of those sort of mechanisms became operational, all in the same direction to promote cancer formation. Then during the second stage here, promotion, again, we looked for a bunch. I wish I could spend an hour or 2 talking about each one of these 10, but I won't get into that, into those kind of details. But here's the bottom line. All those mechanisms, increasing the high protein diet increases the entry of the carcinogen into the cell. It increases an enzyme that activates the carcinogen. It increases the amount that binds the DNA that gives rise to the mutation and so forth. So I don't want to go into too much more detail about that. But here's the key. 10 reactions that we explored, a couple more actually too. Every time we looked for a mechanism to explain the effect of protein on cancer, we found one. Now, some of that research was more convincing than others, but every one of those observations was the same thing. When protein goes up in the diet, right, all of these reactions are turned on simultaneously and work together. So if anyone doubted there's no way to explain this, they should come and look at some of the work we did. So what this showed was that there is no, it dawned on me at that point in time, what is the drug industry? Why are we so concerned about developing a drug, be it for cancer or other things too? Because as it turned out, as I'll show you in a moment, it's far, far more complex than this. And the mere idea that somehow we could find one reaction and then maybe create a chemical to actually alter that reaction in such a way to get the result we want, that's what we're talking about here. So the high-protein diet actually, I listed a couple here, and I won't go into it, actually attenuated. The high-protein diet actually decreased our own cells' ability to prevent cancer. For those of you who are familiar, you know about DNA repair, you probably know what I'm talking about, or intercepting other systems in our body that's used to prevent that. So the high-protein diet is really insidious. It's turning on 8 mechanisms that drive it to form cancer, in a sense. 2 of the mechanisms turned them down. Guess what? Those 2, they should have been going higher because they were protecting us. That's what nature gave to us. So when I finally got to the stage here, this idea of a high-protein diet, and it's not that high, we're talking about in the realm of what we all do, especially we eat meat, that this is the kind of thing that goes on, just across the board. It's quite dramatic. So nutritional control of cancer development involves not one, but multiple mechanisms. I hope I don't want to run out of my time here. So I have to kind of speed along. So when in 2002 to 2005, I was working with my son, who now, by the way, has got his own physician degree. He's a medical director, in fact, of a very significant research program at a major medical school now, and has some studies going on at the moment on using a whole food plant-based diet to actually treat disease like this. One study, he has a group of about 15 women with metastatic breast cancer. These are women who have the breast cancers returned. They're in a serious way. So he's testing this whole idea of using a whole food plant-based diet. Not a drug, the whole food, to see what can happen. More than that a little bit down the road. But in any case, when he and I were working together, writing a book and that sort of thing, I started looking at the literature. How much of these really prominent observations might have existed in the past? All these diseases here. There is evidence in the scientific literature to suggest that they all behave the same way. I mean, you have to kind of twist around and reinterpret and stuff. But a whole food plant-based diet prevents, suspends, and or cures all these diseases. So all of a sudden, here's a new idea. We're not talking about targeted effects, one mechanism, one disease, one this, one that. We're talking about something very special about the whole food itself. Not doing just one thing. It's doing just across the board, a whole bunch of stuff. So this whole food plant-based diet effect is broad. That's an exciting idea. Fundamental to our lives, in a sense. You eat this way, it makes a lot of difference in terms of all kinds of conditions, not just cancer. The effect is really rapid. It's amazingly rapid. We were doing some of this work years ago ourselves. Upon consumption of something, you'll begin to see things change within hours in some cases. Within hours. Certainly within days, weeks, whatever. So the whole food plant-based diet effect, eventually, is what I came to learn, it happens very fast. It happens very fast. And if the dietary change is sustained, the whole food plant-based diet is not something you jump in here today and you correct a problem and then you go back doing what you did before. No. The whole food plant-based diet, you have to keep doing it, and I'm sure all of you know that. Not to come in today and then go back to doing what you did, stay with it. So when it's sustained, then we see these remarkable things that Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Ornish, and others have done with heart disease, and others have done that some with type 2 diabetes. This is quite a number of years later when I was onto this. But in any case, we can use this diet. Here's the story of the future. We can use this diet not just to prevent future problems, we can use this diet to actually reverse existing problems. That's called treatment. That's called treatment. And when we do it with a whole food, everything working together, again, everything working together in a very consistent, impressive way, it turns out that kind of approach has almost no side effects. Whereas drugs, in contrast, are focused on one thing at a time, all the drugs have side effects, unanticipated side effects, some serious. So the drug approach says one thing, and we know how it works and what it does. The nutritional approach is something different. So I'm just simply saying that nutrition, the whole food plant-based diet, basically, I think a case can be made for this with lots of numbers. The whole food plant-based diet cures more diseases than all the best of the pills and procedures combined. That is our future. So we got another challenge here. Foods are composed of endless nutrients and nutrient-like substances. They all act in symphony, which is I like that idea. Just this miraculous way they work together. They resolve a broad range of illness and disease. Okay, now, I told you that you'll hear of Dr. Eston. He may be here, I don't know. Been a very good friend of mine. We've been really good friends for years. But he was doing some work on reversing heart disease with a whole food plant-based diet, essentially. My son, I just mentioned to you, has been doing this kind of work too at this medical school where he is. He turned his attention recently to chronic kidney disease, just another disease. It's a serious problem. It's very costly, by the way. It's one of the real cost factors in medical care. 35 to 40 million people have chronic kidney disease, even more if you count those with diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, and hypertension. It's a big number. It's a big number, very worrisome. And it's actually been increasing in recent years. And the average cost per year, now we bring in consideration of the cost of health care. People who have kidney disease, they're going on the verge or going to dialysis. That's a difficult proposition, I think all of you know. It costs, in the latest figures, the annual cost per year is $75,000 a year above Medicare costs. That breaks the banks for an awful lot of people and causes an awful lot of misery. So we're talking about a big deal. So he as I said, Tom, had together and he followed closely a 69-year-old man who was overweight. He had chronic kidney disease. He had type 2 diabetes. He had hypertension. I mean, he was sick, obviously. He was on the verge of going into dialysis. He said, I'll try it. So Tom got him and organized his diet and made sure he stayed with it. Got to stay with it. And the results, and this was just published in the British Medical Journal, which is one of the top journal in medicine, quite frankly, of this kind. So it's getting some recognition in the medical community for this sort of approach. This man was on 9 pharmaceuticals at the time he got into this, very sick. The insulin was decreased from 210 units to 70 units in 4 days. See how fast it was? 5 of the drugs, he dropped them within 2 months. He's off of 5 of his drugs, insulin dropped, and then for 2 more, the dose was halved. I mean, this is stuff that's recorded. It's really watched over closely. It observes, all the rules that we have to follow and should follow in doing really good formal research. The big deal, kidney disease, it depends on having a good glomerular filtration rate. That's the means by which the liquid is flowing through our kidneys, in good shape. And so this gentleman had a rate of flow, if you will, of 45, which is getting near stage 4. That's dialysis time. At 45, he increased it during that time from 45 to 74%. 73%, and he felt just great after 4.5 months. Chronic kidney disease, can you imagine that? Chronic kidney disease. Now, there are some observations made from time to time, anecdotal kinds of things, claims have been made, but in this case, and the reason I want to point this out, is that this has been published in the British Medical Journal. really a top journal. That's what we need to do in this business, is to do the research properly, well, and then get it into the system so that the professionals begin to understand this. I'll explain more in a moment what I mean by that. So I say nutrition of whole plant-based foods prevents and treats illness and disease outcomes. Both involves prevention and treatment. Same formula. Same formula. It's just really amazing. So let me show you just a jump ahead here, jumping around a little bit here. We spend a lot of money in this country, as you'll know, for healthcare. Big debate. We argue until it's silly at times. It's kind of foolish, these arguments we have. But here's a list of the amount of money we spend in 39 countries like us as of 2018, 2019. These are recent figures. Here's how much money and drug costs we spend the dollars per capita. Look where the U.S. is. We're way above all the others. Isn't that pretty amazing? Is that because we aren't literate in nutrition? What if we knew something about nutrition? What if we told the public about nutrition? What if a lot of people start doing what a lot of you folks are doing? Would healthcare costs go down? So we spend a lot of money. We also use the most pharmaceuticals of any country in the world. By far, there we are, number one. We spend the most money, we use the most drugs. You know, some of us think this is the greatest system in the world because we do that. Again, why are we using drugs and not nutrition? So you say, what do we get for this? What do we get for this with all this money spent? Especially in the way in which it is spent. Life expectancy puts us way down the list, about 44th. How can we spend so much money and use so many drugs and get down there in life expectancy? Now, I know some of you are more familiar with the details of this kind of methodology. You'll say, wait a minute, you got to do this, you got to do that. But overall, the grand scheme of things, our life expectancy is lower than most of those countries. Yet we spend by far and away the most money. When is it going to be time? When we're in the healthcare debate right now that's going on, when is it going to be time when people on either side of the aisle start talking about reducing healthcare costs by making people well? That's another whole discussion. That's another whole discussion that I spent a lot of time in policy development, so I can sort of elaborate on that in a moment. But quite frankly, the public's not being told. The public's not being told this. Again, nutrition literacy. Now let's move on to a couple more ideas, kind of big ideas. This goes back to some of my own research many years ago. We were using protein to turn on cancer, not paying much attention to what kind of protein it was. We just got the protein. We were using casein, the main protein in cow's milk, to turn the cancer on. Coming from a dairy farm, that's a little bit uncomfortable for a while. But in any case, we were using casein to turn it on. So we tried, a couple of my students actually got involved, and we checked out this system with soy protein. Soy protein doesn't do this. It's rather representative of other plant proteins too. Plant proteins seem to have this property. Either in this case, very narrow, but it also has plant proteins don't turn on the development of cholesterol in the blood either. It doesn't turn on heart disease either. So here we see a big distinction between animal proteins and plant proteins, and there is really, as a group, there are major differences between the two in the way they behave. Can't get into that because of time. So animal proteins promote disease formation more effectively than plant proteins in the form of whole food. Okay, now I'm going to take you back to that smoking thing I showed you a little while ago. You know, everybody got excited that, wow, people who smoke, they have more beta-carotene, they get less cancer. Oh, that's a big deal. And so it was talked about. Beta-carotene is an anti-carcinogen. So the United States and Finland at the time, scientists from those two countries got together and decided to do a little study. This is back in the early 90s, actually. They got together to test this remarkable apparent effect of beta-carotene on reducing lung cancer. So they organized a study amongst a bunch of smokers. This group here had beta-carotene supplements. This group over here did not. Very, very simple. Looked at the results. They intended to run the study for 8 years. They had to stop it early. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. So, big study, relatively speaking, at least for this kind of study, 29,000 male smokers. The more beta-carotene people consumed amongst all their smokers, lung cancer was decreased significantly by 19%. That's pretty significant, statistically significant, if you will. However, the people taking a beta-carotene in the form of the pill actually increased lung cancer by 18%. That was a lesson. That was a lesson. And it's been repeated quite a number of times again with other nutrients. When a nutrient is in the food, it operates as nature would have it used. You know, with all these mechanisms and all the other nutrients and all that stuff, that nature knows how to handle that. When we reach in and pull out one of those chemicals, say, oh, that's the answer. When we do that and put it in a pill, we run a high risk of getting maybe even the reverse effect. So when nutrients are acting alone, that's one thing. But when they're acting in food, that's to our benefit. It's one of the reasons, in fact, we have so many side effects of drugs. So this is not really the message for the future. So I'm getting here near the end. And what I've been trying to do here is to illustrate for you what I see as being the provocative nature of what nutrition can do with data, with, real results. I skipped over a lot of the data actually to prove my point. But nutrition is so powerful. And there's only one kind of nutrition. It is not a low-carb diet. That's nonsense. It is a whole food, plant-based diet with the right kinds of foods and lots of other things in the plants too, obviously phytoestrogens or phytonutrients, if you will, and so forth. It raises a question to me that given the fact that nutrition is so complex biologically in doing things, and we tend to be smug about it at times, and okay, if we do this, we get that kind of thing. We see problems. That's been our history in this kind of research. It occurred to me that we overestimate our own ability. And I'll illustrate it this way. When we consume food, let's say we consume a nutrient, we're really interested in that. So we know we can actually measure how much we consume. Think of it theoretically. We consume a spoonful of this, that, or something else, and there's X amount of nutrient in there. Well, when the nutrient is being consumed, it goes through various stages of digestion and metabolism and so forth and so on. Digestion just is arbitrary. It goes through some sort of benchmarks along the way. Absorption, transport, etc., entry, function, and excretion. Okay, that's just an arbitrary breakdown of some of the events that our nutrient has to jump over or get over. Every one of these steps there, going from one stage to the next, the amount that goes from one stage to the next can vary, and this is real published data. It can vary by easily 20%. I used to say that's not a big deal, but just do the math on this. If your nutrient that you're consuming, you know how much it is, you get all the way down to biochemical function, there's no relationship, essentially, within limits. There's no relationship between the nutrient consumed and how much is actually functioning. Our body is so miraculous. Nature is so miraculous. The body is deciding. We eat the right food. The body looks at this thing and decided how much to transport to the next step. Okay? And it's doing all this simultaneously with the thousands of nutrients. So the body's in control. This is what nature is. This is nature. And for us to come along technologically and try to supersede that by taking out one nutrient at a time and use it in the form of a drug possibly or a supplement, worse yet, we could take these kind of things and synthesize new compounds, and we call them drugs. But in any case, there it is. That's the dynamics of the body. So it is just for the sake of argument, adjust the amount of nutrient passed from one stage to another by 20%. We cannot know how much of a nutrient we're consuming is actually at the functional site. We'll never know. Even if we did know, even if we could construct a model that we could know exactly how much is there that we ate here, even if we were to know that, guess what? Add one more nutrient to that mix and everything changes in a lot of cases. Even more to the point, if we could theoretically know how much is exactly here at this point in time, in the next nanosecond, it'd be different. So we've oversimplified the science in this field grossly. And what we've left out of the equation is nature. We have ignored nature, what it can do. And we, to a great extent, haven't even explored how to go about analyzing that question. So I think it's just a very dynamic system. Okay, I did that already. Now, this leads to my final comments. I talk about reductionism. Reductionism, like using one thing at a time. We argue to death over how much fat or this kind of fat. It's all really kind of silly. We talk about these numbers all the time. And we have a lot of confusion in the field right now. We have that. I believe this, you believe that, all that kind of stuff. Well, it turns out that there's a reason why there's so much confusion. A lot of reasons, but one of which is the medical practice system itself. Namely, we tend to assume when we do science, quote unquote, on something to learn something, we focus on one disease at a time. We focus on one cause. We focus on one mechanism. All those are false. They're really all false. Yes, we can see effects sometimes with a single nutrient, but usually it doesn't last or it's not whatever. We develop drugs to sort of focus it. One, there, this, that kind of thing. We get random side effects. So the training in the area of medicine is focused on the use of targeted drugs and the presumption that we're dealing with a disease one at a time under very specific conditions. That's medicine. That is medicine. In the meanwhile, in medical schools, there's not a medical school in this country that really teaches nutrition. It's left out of the equation. Now, yes, there's some schools will have up to 10, 15, maybe even 20 lectures. But that kind of information at that point in time is usually elective, number one. And number two, it's not the kind of nutrition that I talk about, I can assure you. So this is why nutrition is not taught in medical schools, because nutrition is a different animal. I shouldn't use that metaphor. But nutrition is a broad-based thing. It's whole food, and it has these marvelous effects. It happens fast. There's lots of drugs, so forth. It doesn't fit within the paradigm of reductionism that's typically found in medical schools. This is also why among the 28 National Health Institute, National Institutes of Health, among the 28 institutes, I think there's 27 now, but of those, do you know there's one for heart disease, one for obesity, one for aging, one for this, one for that? Do you know there's not one institute that's been dedicated to nutrition? There is no National Institute of Nutrition. So what do we have? We have our professionals, our treasured, precious professionals going out to practice medicine. Not taught this subject, right? They're not even getting the kind of information they really deserve, by having an Institute of Nutrition. And also, I should say, there's no mechanism, no good mechanism for doctors to even be compensated for practicing this kind of medicine. A lot of that depends on the number of medical specialties. There's about 130 medical specialties, I think, is the last count, according to Medicare programs, something like that. Not one of that, that's what generates opportunities for physicians to be paid. Not one of those medical specialties out of the 130 is for nutrition counseling. So we've shut ourselves out of the whole system. Nutrition has been shut out. This is a summary of what I already said about holistic nutrition. All those things working together, whole food blood-based diet. And there's one more thing, and I wish I had the time to explain to you. It's the most exciting part of what I think I've come to know. It really has to do with animal protein. Where did we get that idea from? Why haven't we used it? Anyhow, nutrition works this way, whole foods. This is a highly integrated, interactive, holist system, I spelled it with a W, minus the cult of animal protein. In other words, my advice is very simple. Let's not get caught in the weeds, talking about this nutrient or that vitamin. Forget that stuff. The big effect that we'll see for the average population is just two simple ideas. Simple. Try to stick with the whole foods. That doesn't mean we can't dice them and slice them and cook them and so forth and so on a bit. When I say the whole food, I'm talking about you take a bite of food, your body's able to use all the stuff in that to work together. That's what I mean by whole food. So number one, consume a diet, basically of whole foods, as much as possible. Number two, don't eat anything. Try to avoid. Try to avoid foods that have animal protein in it. Not because of the animal protein itself necessarily, that's certainly a factor, but also because of all the other changes that occur in that kind of diet that feeds into the system. Those two ideas. Now, you might argue there's something else we should say, don't add oil or don't add sugar and that kind of thing. Fair enough. Because when we add stuff, keep in mind, we're adding things out of context, especially like added oil. Added oil, most of it is pro-inflammatory, if you will, and causes mischief. So, but I say whole food, just let it at that. If we just spread that message to the rest of the world, just those two ideas alone, we would get, I'm convinced, at least 90% of the potential benefits that's out there to be obtained. And we could save 90% of the healthcare costs if everybody did that. We're so caught up in arguing about these details. It's mindless. And then the people out there who should be doing something about it, they can't figure out what we're talking about. Well, I heard you say that, and you said that kind of thing. That is counterproductive. If we have to just really understand what whole food can do it, and if people don't understand it, just try it. Just try it. So anyhow, there's my book, Whole, where I try to elaborate on that. And I'm finishing up with this right here. Holistic nutrition involves countless nutrients, mechanisms, and health outcomes that are all favorable. Holistic metabolism within the cell is infinitely complex. It changes within nanoseconds of time, all for the purpose of nature. Holistic nutrition is a constitutional effect, and history shows how it was suppressed with consequences. The new book I have is actually tracing that history. And I suggest, I don't mean to be pretentious in this case whatsoever about this theory of relativity, but I think that the realization that nutrients work together in the form of whole food, and the body is knowing all the time, okay, I adjust this, I adjust that. All of this is happening in a beautiful, beautiful symphony. Beautiful symphony. I call that that's the biological theory of relativity. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop there. I know I'm boring you also. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think a lot of you are already converts before you came here. But anyhow, so much for that. I'm curious, we do have a few minutes. We got 20 minutes for questions if anybody cares to ask. You know, if you could turn those lights off now, I'd like to see the people. Can you turn those lights off in the back?
Hello. Hi, Dr. Campbell.
Yes.
I'm over here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have taken your program, your eCornell program, and it was wonderful. I did it in addition to my nutrition certification in Canada. I'm wondering, is there any plan to have a part 2, more education that we can take from you?
Yes, the course to which you referred, I should have had that slide here. going to catch the devil with those who are running that. We have a nonprofit, an online course, very exciting, collaboration with Cornell University. We've had that going for a while. We've got, and you get a certificate for it. We've got some other speakers in the course. And in any case, we've had, I think, it was over 30,000 graduates so far in that course. That's the course that Cornell canceled that I was teaching on the campus. So I took it out and put it elsewhere, online. So it has some history. That story to that has a history. But anyhow, we are going to add another course just in another month or two. Another whole certificate program on food and the environment. I didn't touch on the environmental issue. I suggest that aside from the cost of health care and those sorts of things, that if we don't get the environmental issue resolved in our minds and what to do about it, all the rest that I talked about makes no difference. The environment is so, so important. We've got to deal with that. And the number one cause of environmental problems is livestock rearing. So it all hangs together. So yes, we'll have another course in another month or two.
Hi. Over here, hi. I'm Kitty Victoria. I'm a HEMONC fellow in my third year at University of Vermont. And I took your course as well, and I'm also doing integrative medicine training. So I'm planning to treat patients, oncology patients with plant-based nutrition and really heal them. Thank you. I wanted to firstly thank you, Dr. Campbell, for laying the groundwork and opening the door up to so many physicians to be able to use this wonderful healing practice, and just thank you for that. I wanted to get your advice. You mentioned about non-biased research, and I think that's something that we all struggle with, getting funding, and as you stated, the NIH only funds about 10%. How do you see moving forward, moving the needle on this issue? Like, what can we do to convince people that have been in research a long time that could be potential mentors to look at this issue?
Well, I used to have an opportunity years ago of being in the political scene a little bit, speaking before congressional committees and that sort of thing. That's kind of come to a halt to some extent because, I'm talking nonsense, according to them. I would like to get back, actually, and speak to one or two of the candidates that are now running. I had spoken to those kind of people before and informed them of what this is. They talk about health care, reducing health care costs, but they're missing the boat. I wanted to get the government out of the business of basically telling the public what they should do, because they are saying things and are backed by industry. And the reason all that happens, I have to add this, the reason that happens, in my view, is because of the Supreme Court 2010 decision, Citizens United. Now we can buy politicians. We do. We buy politicians. Those politicians then sort of tag along behind the people who are paying for their elections. And so the information that comes out from the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Health is missing the mark. It's really missing the mark, and we got to find ways, to get in there and make ourselves heard. And I think the average public can do that if they become conscious of this. We have my older son started out with an idea of the so-called pods. Some of you may have heard of that. We've got about 400. It's kind of struggling to get off the ground a little bit, but it's run by someone who's here locally. Jody, are you here? Oh, well, in any case, the director of that's a nonprofit. It's been supported in the background by my older son, who has these kinds of foods on the shelf, now being picked up by major food chains, like Publix, Harris Teeter, Lowe's, I don't know, Market Basket, I think, or something, I'm not sure. But usually taking that model, getting some revenue, and then committing a portion of that revenue to hold down the cost of the food, especially for people in the inner city who can't afford this kind of food. So we got these pods all over the country. Hopefully we're going to have more opportunity for them to be getting up and running. So that's another way. Energizing those communities, working at the grassroots level.
I'm so grateful that not only for all you do, but also that at the end you mentioned the environment. And I have a deep question for you, if there's some way that you can propagate this forward, that since methane and carbon dioxide together are causing so much of the heating up of the planet, if once upon a time, long ago, there were scholarships given to bright high school students and college students to further particular experiments, why have I not heard of anything about a project of methane gas and carbon dioxide put together and maybe combined with other elements to form something solid that might even bring in the possibility of absorbing some of the heat that's been coming down from the sun, but also absorbing the methane and carbon dioxide in itself. And maybe if that's a solid substance, maybe it could even be made into housing to house some of the many migrant people who are going to be all over the place very soon.
Yeah, actually, it's a very good question concerning actually young people in this, but it's all of us. And it's my experience, I'm sure from most of you folks too, that the young people are getting energized on this question concerning the environment, perhaps more than anything else. The problem is they don't quite sometimes get the idea that it's really the food that we're consuming. Don't quite get that. We need to get that idea across. Raising livestock for our use is a big deal. We have a daughter in the Dominican Republic right now who has a project too that's going to be added to the course. Students can take the course, and then for those who want a field experience, they can go to the Dominican Republic where she lives and see the damage that's being done firsthand, and then participate in discussions, how this might be energized, this whole discussion might be energized even more. The carbon sink is the idea. Planting lots of trees, restoring tree growth. In the tropics, that's possible to happen pretty fast. And that could begin to help cause major changes. Just to demonstrate, there's a lot to be done there, for sure. Yeah.
Hi there. So I published New Life magazine. For 30 years, we've been trying to get the insurance companies to back us up for nutrition. I realized that the synergistic effect between the insurance companies and the AMA and the FDA is a tremendous connection. And now you can get drugs cheaper through the insurance companies than you can get through the drugstore. I still believe, though, if we can get the insurance companies behind us, since people will live longer and they'll have less disease, and they'll need less insurance. I still think that's a key.
Yeah, you're absolutely right in theory. In practice, I was once involved with the major health insurance company in the country. Was one of the district presidents who got the book, got excited about it. I'll tell you who it was, United Health. And so he read the book and got all excited about it, wanted to send me to the headquarters office in Minnesota. Right? They didn't want to hear this story. So I talked to them about what's wrong here? Why can't they do what you said, get involved in that way? They'd rather be part of a big pot themselves. The whole industry has a great deal of influence, and they control the whole 9 yards, essentially. And so if one come out and start doing this, perhaps, but if a big company did that, that means the whole industry has to decline. And they'd rather be a player in the big pot than a player in the small pot. But that's one way it's been explained to me by some lobbyist friends. So we got these big problems. We got to sort it out. Back to the political dialogue that we should be having too. I appreciate that. Just as a side story, I appreciate very much the free market system, but we don't have a free market system, quite frankly. We're struggling with that idea. But in any case, even respecting that concept is so far out of hand. We're just aggregating money into the top few, as many of you have heard so many times. And they control the discussion. And pharmaceutical companies are one of the biggest problems on that score.
Mr. Campbell, I had the honor of watching a brief interview on a documentary, Dying to Know, and the basis of that documentary was on Max Gerson. Is it not true that Max Gerson would be considered the father of nutritional therapy, who immigrated from Europe during the Holocaust and presented these nutritional types of therapies to America, but he was, in effect, silenced?
Yes, I'm familiar with Max Gerson and also knew his daughter who recently passed in the late 90s. And I read the testimony that he was asked to give to Senate hearings in Washington. It was tragic. It was sad. And so it got to the point where he had to leave the country, as you know, and took up practice in Tijuana, Mexico. And they've continued to do good things from my perspective. Haven't published very much, not in the professional literature, but what they have published is impressive. And so, yes, Dr. Max Gerson was on to this idea, no question about it, as were, I should say, many before him, 10, even centuries before. And he was attempting to do what he could under difficult circumstances. So, yeah, the Gerson Clinic is good. I just wish that we could respect, from a societal point of view, governmental point of view, why take an organization like that and label them as heresy and then force them to go through the problems they've had to go through? They should also, I think that's changing somewhat now. There's more interest in that kind of approach than there has been before.
And just one brief question. With regard to the environmental concerns and all the pesticides and the GMOs, how in fact, and what types of food should people focus on? Should it be based on organics? Is that the best that a person could do at this point?
Well, again, focusing on organic, I wish I could tell you that we have really good data to showing that people who only eat organic food have better health than those who don't. To be honest about it, it doesn't look all that impressive. There's some benefit, yes. It's probably due to a lack of having a methodology that could detect the real differences. That's part of the problem. We use organic, as much as we possibly can. It's a good way to go, and especially when it doesn't include GMOs. GMOs is a problem. There's a lot of unanticipated consequences that may arise in the future that we don't know about, so we're carrying this a massive experiment on the American public. But in any case, organic, yes, that's one way to think about it. But if we don't have access to organic, don't go back then to eating. Well, okay, if I can't get that, I'll go ahead and eat meat, milk, and dairy. No. You can still get the vegetables and fruits and grains when you have them available. That's far better than reverting back to the other kinds of food. So organic, yes. Organic is a nice step to take. And my feeling is that without necessarily having the data to prove the point, my feeling is that, yes, they're going to be better. They certainly taste better. So.
Yeah, I have 3 quick questions. One is, what do you think of whey protein powder? And the second question is, when you blend fruits and vegetables in a blender, do you lose the benefit of fiber? And the third question is, what do you think about dried vegetables and fruit powders which they sell in capsules?
So whey protein first.
Yeah.
The whey protein, of course, has about the same properties as casein. It is an animal protein. It is, in fact, a dairy protein. And it's a mixture of some things. And so it's not just an absolutely pure, protein alone by itself. But it tends to have the same properties as casein does. So I'm not a fan of whey protein.
Okay.
I wish we had more specific experimentation to really compare in the theory. But all in all, if there are some differences that some people have noted, I just tell a person, back off just for a second and realize that's an animal protein. It's going to be occupying some of our caloric intake. And so the whey protein thing, I'm not, as I say, a fan of that. And then you said the other was dried? Oh, plantain? Oh, the Vitamix and stuff, like blender. Oh, the blender. Fiber. Oh.
Is the fiber reduced if you blend it in a Vitamix or any other
Yeah.
application?
I'm not concerned about that, to be honest about it, because the fiber at a molecular level is not being broken up, really. It may be broken up with respect to various components of the fiber, and there are different components, when you do that kind of thing. But for the most part, the properties of those fibers are going to be quite similar, except for one thing. Food, when it's blended like that, we drink it, we're bypassing the first stage of digestion, which may be a cost. Because we gulp it down like that, it can be absorbed fairly readily. We enjoy it that way. But chewing food is good. It really is. And by just jumping to the blender all the time, I'm not sure. Sure, it's good. We have all the right materials, and you get yourself a nice smoothie, let's say. That's good. It's right stuff. But I'm getting it a little bit out of my lane in a sense because I don't know that we have the kind of data that really allowed me to be more specific than that.
Is powdered vegetables and fruits in a capsule
Right.
equivalent to eating the fruit or vegetable itself?
No. I've been presented with that argument for some time. It was back in the 80s when the Academy had asked me to be the person on the stand, looking at those kind of claims. I got a chance to see and learn more about what was known at the time. And I think, first off, the fiber, I forget what the second half of the question, I got off track here. It was the fiber. Oh, yeah. We're not really losing the fiber. Yeah. Well, I don't know. The whole food is the best, ideally. I wish we did. I can't be giving such definitive answers on things like that. Your guess is almost as good as mine. But some of the blended stuff, yeah, you're not losing the effects of the fiber. Yes, I would say that. Oh, I know what I was going to say. The fiber in the food does provide bulk. That obviously provides bulk. And that does help to reduce the total caloric consumption by some amount, which is not bad. It's okay. So, yeah, having it in bulk form is better than having it in liquid form, if I can say that. I think we're done. We're going to take you outside. Okay, so I must go. Thank you very much.